Welcome everyone. We have with us Ian Reilly and Vela Georgiev to give us an hour of their time and some great learning and inspiration. Before we get started, I'd like to actually acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we meet today. Now we meet all over the place. We've got people in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and ACT today, but I'm going to actually recognise the people of where I am physically, which is the Macedon Ranges in Victoria, and it is the peoples of the Dja Dja Wurrung, and I would like to respect their elders past and present. So here we are at a lunchtime inspo event, and it's brought to you by Stone and Chalk. For those of you who don't know about Stone and Chalk, we're Australia's leading impact network for emerging technology. And our partner in crime is AusCyber. We work very closely with them. We've curated over 400 startups and scale-ups, and we started in fintech, but we've developed into cybersecurity, AI, prop tech, agtech, which obviously we're going to talk about today, regtech, space tech, and beyond. We are a not-for-profit, so our objective is to firstly identify, nurture, connect and propel those who are looking to solve the world's most pressing social and business challenges. My name is Abby and I'm actually the event manager for the Pivot program. This is a fantastic initiative that has been powered by Launch Victoria, and it's a program that is designed to take people from a corporate or government environment into a startup scale-up opportunity. Just some housekeeping about today. We've got some fabulous curated questions. It is a lunchtime inspo session, so it's a relaxed conversation to hopefully motivate you and get you inspired to do some great things in the agricultural sector. So the people who are going to make this happen, Ian Reilly, who is an entrepreneur. Ian has been involved in working with both agtech and medtech for a period of time. He's also got great experience working in the private sector, working with government, working with corporate, and also working with startups and creating his own. So he is an inspiration and a genuine innovator. Vela is, interestingly, both Ian and Vela are engineers. So there's going to be some exacting discussion, I'm sure, in this session today. Vela is actually the CEO and operating partner for Tenacious Ventures, and Tenacious Ventures are supporting the agtech startup sector more than anyone in Australia at the moment. So she'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So I'll now hand over to Vela and Ian for an inspiring chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Abigail. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. And as Abigail has mentioned, being an engineer myself, kind of have a common history with Ian. And so hopefully that will come through a little bit as we talk. In our conversation today, we'll cover off a little bit about Ian's pivot from corporate to startups, the joys and challenges that came with taking that journey and running a fast-scaling startup, a little bit around the future of ag, and so much more. But maybe the first place to start would be to go back to where Ian and I first crossed paths in the early 2000s. We were both working for the same company, actually, Vision Systems out in the southeast suburbs of Melbourne. And so probably the first question to kick off our session with would be maybe, Ian, if you can share a little bit with us about your, I guess, the pivot to the startup, or more correctly, what you were doing before you made this leap of faith.
Yeah.
Might be our first kickoff.
Sure. Yeah, a long time ago, Bella and I were working for the same company. And prior to that, I had spent time working with a number of different sectors. So I'd worked in defence and aerospace and renewable energy, and working for the company Vision Systems. I worked for the consulting part of that, which was Invitech, which is still out there working today. And, I spent about 20 years developing new technology for companies around the world. So these were organizations that had a new idea, or they had a difficult technology problem to solve and they wanted to turn that into a product. So that meant working, a lot, leading small and large cross-function multinational teams in different parts of the world, working for companies that were in medtech, some software, food and beverage companies, fast-moving consumer goods, and industrial products like smoke detectors, which Bella and I originally worked on. And those companies were predominantly in the UK, Europe, US, and then Japan a little bit later. Also worked with very large companies like GE, Coca-Cola, down to very small startups, some in Silicon Valley, in around Boston, Switzerland, Cambridge, and Belgium. And so I had exposure, I think, to a lot of that very, very large corporate and also very small startup. And the other thing was a lot of these startups in particular, they were commercialising technology that come out of, a university. So some out of Duke, there was MIT, Harvard, Cambridge, EPFL in Lausanne in Switzerland and other places. So I was able to see also how that could be done really well, very successfully, and how it could be done very poorly at the same time with consequent disasters. So doing that taught me a lot about international business as well and how to do that. And I think that experience was a great foundation to really have sort of there to launch a startup at the time when I was ready and maybe able to do that. I think the really, critical piece of learning that I got out of that was we often had to solve a challenging problem that no one had solved, somewhere in the world, and we often had a short time to solve it. And what I realized was that a lot of the technically challenging problems that people are trying to solve can be solved if you focus a lot more on the market need and understanding what the customer actually needs. And you can often get a match between available technologies that match just one part of that need. And that can be enough for a company to launch a product, get a foothold in the market, and then grow from there. And that's what a lot of the very big and small startups were doing in the States in particular. They're just trying to understand the need, match the technology, and just get a foothold. So that was really critically valuable lesson to learn when launching Adjacense, because we had some IP that came out of CSIRO, but it was very early stage and pretty simple. And there were a whole lot of technical hurdles that we needed to solve, and regulatory hurdles and market, unknowns and hurdles as well. And so most companies that CSIRO took the tech to, like, big international companies, including Gallagher, who just recently bought Adjacense, they looked at that and said, there's too many problems, too much risk, too many unknowns, we can't do that, which gave me the opportunity to look at it and say, based on what I've done in the past, I think we can solve these problems. I don't know how, but I think it's ready to be able to get some money together and with the right people and a good qualified team led and focusing on market need, we can solve those problems one way or another. It also meant that for the first couple of years of the startup, I didn't do a lot of technical work. I spent most of it trying to understand the landscape and the market and needs and opportunities and so on. So that was pretty important. And, probably without that experience, I wouldn't have taken the step to launch Adjacense. I realized we haven't said what that was, and maybe should I talk about that briefly?
Yes, I think, although it might be a little bit hard with the blurred background for people to see, but that's fantastic. So maybe before you go any further, we now know that you were an engineer and you had exposure to a lot of fantastic products and thinking, and that exposure led you to consider and eventually start a startup. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that startup is, Adjacense, and what it does. And I see you've also got the product samples.
Yeah, one of. Yeah, I also grew up on a farm, and my farming background and family comes from central Queensland. So in 2011, I was out there on a farm visiting a farmer, and he was talking about his problems managing his cattle. And it prompted me to think maybe there was a way there he could automate the movement of his cattle around his farm just using his computer with a sort of a GPS-based electric fence. And I thought it was a crazy idea, but maybe this existed already. So I did some research and found out it's an old idea, been around for years, like going back to the 1980s, but no one had turned it into a product. but CSIRO seemed to have done some research on it. So one thing led to another, and I decided that, this was worth commercialising. And the kickoff came from a grant offered by the Victorian state government to see if they could use this technology to help keep cattle out of rivers and waterways in Victoria and solve a problem. Kicked off with a small grant in 2014. And from there, I worked on my own and went from grant to grant and built a team, got investors on board, including Gallagher, the international New Zealand company. And we built eShepherd, this is the neck band that goes on the cattle, which you can see. It goes around their neck and contains inside there's a GPS, inertial motion sensors, various other sensors, an aerial for a LoRa protocol connection back to a base station on the farm, which is then internet connected, typically via mobile phone or satellite. And this sits on the neck of the animal and then watches it and controls where it goes. The whole system then is just a classic Internet of Things IoT system with something on an animal connected by LoRa to base station cloud system. And then the farmer uses their tablet or a computer and basically draws a fence, a paddock on their map of their farm. And then that gets sent to each collar, neck band, and then that just keeps the animal within that paddock. And if they move the paddock, the whole system then moves those cattle gently across to the next paddock. So as we say, you can be sipping a latte in London and move your cattle in California from anywhere.
So essentially with that, you have the virtual fence. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the problem that you were solving for the customer, but also specifically how did that catalyze your decision? Was it the connection to the farm that made you want to make decision life stage? How did you decide that problem was ready and something that Ian Reilly was going to tackle and solve?
I think all of the above. One, I was about 51 or 49, and I was thinking, if I'm going to launch a tech startup, which I'd love to do, now is the time. I can't wait any longer. From a business point of view, I had left my previous company and had my own consulting company, Ultratech, which I'm still running today, providing consulting services to startups and SMEs. I could easily turn off from that and focus on this. I didn't have to leave my job, so to speak. But the other one, I think the more driving passion was that we grew up on a struggling farm. We had sheep and cattle, and in the 1970s, it was a difficult time for farmers. We had floods, bushfires, and droughts to contend with, and gradually we ended up not farming anymore and sold the farm eventually. It was a great place to grow up, but I really wanted to be able to do something for those farming communities. And this was a great way to do that, something that I could draw on and, that I could relate to that a lot of other technology people couldn't. And the fact that it was such a difficult problem, that automatically told me most people are not going to even try this.
Yep.
So maybe I'm foolish enough and passionate enough that maybe I can do something that other people can't. I should have a go. So I seriously felt, partly it was excitement and the opportunity to do it. But the other one was, there was a sense of giving back and the moral obligation that if this has to be made available, and farmers, I talked to a lot of farmers who were desperate to get it. They just saw it as the golden opportunity. If they could have that, it would be so great. I thought I really should do this as well. Right. This was the right thing to do.
So it sounds to me like not only do we need product market fit, but we also need product passion fit. And in your case, this was very much in the center of your passion, both personally and professionally, and where you wanted to go. And maybe knowing that there was technological challenges in your background as an engineer, knowing that you could apply some of that rigor to move forward and hopefully find a solution, which you did. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what were some of the biggest challenges in your time at Agistance as you not only made headway in the technology, but also scaled that team from 7 to 70 and went through various rounds of funding.
The number one biggest problem that outweighed everything else was funding. Going from one founding round to the next, and just the initial first couple of years without any steady funding and getting a grant and then running out of money and then trying to keep things going with your own money and all of that. That is the single hardest thing to do, is to raise the money. And the first equity is by far the hardest thing to raise. And you can't do anything without money. Nothing serious, right? So getting the money was really important. And those early stage grants were just a wonderful, they weren't a bonanza, but without that, nothing would have happened. We just couldn't have scraped enough together to do anything. The technical issues were solved primarily by getting a really good bunch of people together that were really skilled and that I had a lot of confidence in, and giving them the funds and the money to move ahead and start dealing with the technical problems and solving them. I was really helped a lot by also getting a worldwide sort of bunch of collaborators together. So that included people like Gallagher in New Zealand and then Ag Research, but also I did a worldwide tour very early on. I went to MIT and the US Department of Agriculture, who'd done work in this, and they were helpful. And I went to the UK and to Europe and to Ireland, looking for people that would provide help. And some of them provided some really good insight, which is really important. That was really helpful to also to lay the groundwork for what would work and what wouldn't work in the marketplace and to know where to focus. The regulatory issues was a hard one. And for that, it's a still ongoing process, but that meant lobbying politicians, ministers, chiefs of staff, heads of departments over a long period of time and working on that. The problem of, getting a product that worked for a market need, one of the big challenges was there were so many needs around the world in different places, so many applications that it could be used for. What would we focus on first? But the process of understand the need and try and match that need to the technology to that need, that worked. And that was really important. So I'll give you an example. One of the things they said was, how are you going to communicate to this collar? Because it's out in the middle of nowhere, there's no phone towers. And the whole phone network is patchy across Australia, America. You can't rely on getting a phone service. So how are you going to communicate? But by doing some investigation, you find out that across Victoria, or even a fair part of Queensland, they have coverage at some places in their farm. They don't have it everywhere and they can't download movies everywhere, but we don't need to download movies. We just need a place somewhere where they've got mobile phone coverage. And we haven't discovered a farm yet that we can't reach that way. And for the really out of the way places, they have subsidized, satellite connections everywhere across Australia.
Yep.
And it was like everyone kept raising this problem, and it actually turned out to be a non-event, a non-problem. That was the least of our worries. Yeah.
It sounds like in some cases you were having to educate both the customers, the market, and other people about what was and wasn't able to be already, or I guess our infrastructure already in place versus what might need to be set up.
We didn't have everything, but we didn't need everything. We had enough.
Yeah.
And enough for our market. And that was the most important thing.
And how did you find with developing that people and culture and aspect in Grow Rapid company around a new product, in this case first, something never done before? How did you go about making that a great place to work?
Yeah, that's a very interesting challenge. And I think we went through what I'd call 3 different stages. So at first, we started off with a couple of people working part-time. They were specific experts. So one was my colleague, Lee Lancaster, who you know. Chris had a lot of experience, like me, developing new tech products. So I brought him on board as a CTO, Chief Technology Person, to basically say, Chris, you develop the technology and the product. I got an animal training expert with a PhD through the University of Melbourne. She was very multi-skilled. So in the early stages, I got people who had expertise that I needed, but that were multi-talented. So if you needed someone to do social media, Sally, my animal training expert, did social media. If you needed someone to look after some bookkeeping, she did that too. Organised travel, Sally did that too, you know. So she was like a general secretary and an animal training expert. Chris came on board and he added a whole set of new skills as well. So only with a couple of people, we had a big range of skills. And then we kept doing that till we got to about 9 or 10. And then things started to really grow. And we went from, in 12 months, we went from 4 people to 16. And then in the next 12 months, we went from 16 to 45. And that growth, the second growth spurt, was really difficult to manage. And we were under all sorts of, we were actually rolling the product onto farms at this point in trials. We were having technical challenges where things worked 99% of the time, but we had to find the last 1%. Debugging software on cattle in the middle of nowhere was terribly difficult and very, very time consuming. Took a lot of manpower. And so that was a real struggle. I think one of the things that helped us is that by recruiting a team, like an executive team, if you like, of like-minded people, that helps a lot in those people then recruiting a set of like-minded people as well. And I think that helped us a lot in keeping that level of cohesion. But one of the things that happens, which is, is logical, but is difficult to deal with sometimes, is that the people that you need in that first phase, that early stage, often by the time you get 3 or 4 years later, the company has grown to be something different, and their skill sets, the need for their skill set in some cases has disappeared, or it's not in demand, and you actually need a different skill set. So you end up employing more experienced corporate people and less startup-y people. And you need people who are going to set rules and keep rules. Whereas a lot of the people you want at the start are the people who break rules and like breaking rules.
Yeah.
And so making that transition was hard for some people, and some of them left, which was okay. Some of them, we, particularly at downtimes, when the pandemic hit, we had to make some very hard decisions about some people we had to let go, and we tried to keep them on a JobKeeper, and eventually we couldn't do that either, and we just had to let them go. But have to be prepared for that change in mindset and people. At the start, we had a part-time bookkeeper who worked 1 day a week, and that bookkeeper is still working part-time, 1 day, 2 days a week. He's still there.
Yep.
But we've now got to see, we went to a CFO.
Yep. Yep.
And then they employed someone else to help with this, and someone else to help with that. And, the needs change. Yeah.
It seems like you've gone through that transition from generalists to specialists, and depending on, I guess, ultimately adapting to what the company needs, as you've said, and in your case, very much being able to leverage the breadth and depth of skills that you've had, both as an engineer, perhaps to solve some of the technical problems, but also you've stepped up into that COO role. And so maybe you can tell us, do you think some of those technical skills helped you as a COO or a founder? And do you think in those early stages that founders and COOs should have technical skills?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I think one of the crucial things that I found, leading teams to develop new products was that good product design management comes from being able to make and manage good design decisions. And so having the technical background to be able to help people direct and make decisions is really helpful. But I've seen a lot of people do that very successfully by being able to, have a trusted partner or a good team behind them and use the skills of that team. So in my case, I think that experience of developing new technologies and work, being able to assess CSIRO's, kit and saying, okay, this bit of string and, it's held together with duct tape and there's blue tack in it as well, I can see. And yep, you made that to work on a herd of cattle for a few weeks in Queensland. But I can see how that, with all of these technology problems you've told me, if we can solve them, I think I could make that into a product. So that assessment came from me, in the experience of, okay, this is at a level of maturity that I think we can turn it into a product.
Yeah.
If I hadn't had that background experience, I wouldn't have been able to make that assessment. I would have been able to maybe engage someone like me to go and work with me to assess it and say, okay, I think we can do this.
Yeah.
You'd need to have someone, like that you could really trust and knew that they gave you good advice, because you've got to base all your passion and everything for launching that startup on that advice. So you've got to be pretty trusting of that. I think, having done that, the thing that made it happen comes back to all the other things, which is, burning passion, a drive to work 7 days a week and all hours and whatever it took, determination, perseverance, I'll do whatever it takes attitude and sacrifice whatever I need to sacrifice in order to make it happen. You need that. That's, non-negotiable, I think, in a startup CEO, unless you just happen to, stumble across something that takes off like hotcakes and sells everywhere and everyone wants to throw money at you. That does happen, but I reckon I've never seen that happen to anyone.
Yeah. So it sounds a bit like sort of that patience, determination, perseverance, and tenacity, and all of those attributes, are really the core things to propel you forward. And that, you can find technical co-founders or other bits that might help augment that skill, but having the drive, counts as much as having the skill to be able to look at some of the problems.
Yeah. And, if you think about any new tech or new service or new product that, a startup then launches, you can ask the question, why doesn't this already exist? And the reason is because it's hard. And I don't think it matters whatever startup you're doing, it's going to be hard, and that's why it doesn't exist right now. And what gets you through the hard part are that drive, determination, vision, passion, sometimes illogical and irrational, but a firm belief and faith that you're going to make it happen. And if you don't, you're going to die trying.
Well, I think it's almost a perfect segue into thinking a little bit more around that ecosystem that goes into supporting an entrepreneur and getting those ideas off the ground. And, particularly with agtech, we're likely to have some sector-specific accelerators like SproutX. I guess there to help with innovation and, also raising the awareness and profile of agtech. Do you have any sort of thoughts around accelerator programs and their contribution to the ecosystem?
So when I started AgSense 2014, there were a few startup hubs around. Accelerators and incubators were emerging and not focused on ag tech. The amount of ag tech stuff was almost non-existent, to be honest. And, that was helpful. I think what helped me was the fact that I had spent a couple of years in Australia locally working with startups as a consultant and being part of some industry organisations like Biotech and others. I had relationships with government that I was cultivating to try and encourage them to help develop the medtech sector. And so I had what was called a network, and I deliberately built that network with a view that I would use that to help launch a startup. So when I started AgtechSense, that network was pretty much in place, and I had, tentacles into universities, governments, particularly Victorian state government and other places that were really valuable. And that replaced, my dependence, if you like, on the startup ecosystem. The startup ecosystem, though, is now, I think it's great, and it's matured a lot and grown a lot since 2014, which has been really good to see. I think, though, it still has, a long way to go. One of the most critical things for us is we went through 3 accelerator hubs, co-working spaces, one of which was Blue Chili. So we weren't part of their program, but we used their co-working space for a year. The other one was Sprout X. We were, I think, the first or second company to move into Sprout X, and we occupied a fair bit of the floor space in there all the time we were there. But it was great, and part of the reason was it's a great way to scale, start with nothing, have, a boardroom, meeting rooms, a printer, a photocopier, a reception service, and a whole lot of other things for basically a few $100 a month for a seat. Great to just move in part-time, full-time, scale up and all the rest of it. And even though we weren't part of the accelerator program, whatever, Blue Chili or Sprout X, they had, every 2 or 3 days, there was a seminar on this and a seminar on that. And they had, VCs walking through the place, and you met them and all of that. And that was fantastic, just resource. Like, I thought, I've got a question about this. So I turned around, asked the person behind me whose startup is doing this or that. And, it's fantastic. And that was the same in Sprout X. It was great. So that, I think less so the accelerator and incubator hubs, but the hubs that are providing that service and that ecosystem is really, just so critical, I think, for startups to be able to make use of. Yeah, I think that fundamentally, though, AgtechSense would never have got going the way it did without that $75,000 grant that fell out of nowhere, supposedly, because a bunch of people in Northeast Victoria in a pub got together and said, why don't we put this forward as a program? So serendipity is really important as well. The startup hubs and that really help serendipity.
Yep, awesome.
They help with the connections.
So I guess sort of with that 75K as being, I think, one of the early grants sort of to commercialize the technology, I guess it's somewhat different. Some of the accelerators might take equity or those types of things, or not, depending. But this was very much a non-equity based grant, I'm presuming.
Yeah, no, it was they're all non-dilutive grants, our original. Yeah.
Yep. So maybe I guess with that in mind, and sort of talking about the struggles that you faced and funding being one of the main ones, who do you think needs to really be around the decision-making table to accelerate the development of agtech in Australia, and also maybe how it should be funded?
Yeah. So I have some very strong views about some of that, as you can imagine. So if you think about agtech, I spent quite a bit of time in the UK and crisscrossed the US, and I went on some trade missions and a bunch of other things that Austrade and other people put on. Now, the UK Trade Investment Group were wonderful in introducing me to a whole lot of people in Europe and so on. Agtech in each country is really a sort of hodgepodge of government, industry, VC funding, and I'd say the landscape, particularly in Australia, has matured a lot in that time. It's matured overseas as well, a lot, but particularly in Australia has matured a lot. There's still actually very few VCs that really focus on agtech. When you go and knock on their door and talk to them and find out who they fund and how, your chances of getting them are less than 0.1%. In Australia, we have what's called the RDC system, the Rural Development Corporation. So Dairy Australia, MLA, Australian Wool Innovation, GRDC, all of those groups, which are farmer funded. So they're very farmer problem focused, and they're one-to-one match funding with the federal government. So that's great. Some of them have funding mechanisms for startups. Some of them are looking at it. It's all a bit of a hodgepodge. You got, MLA with the MLA donor company, but that's difficult to work with, and there's no uniform approach. But, it's moving in the right direction, and that's good. To be serious about developing agtech, governments need to get serious and actually put money down on the table. And if you want to see a country that does that very well, have a look at Israel. If you want to see countries that do really well for other sectors, have a look at the Netherlands, Belgium, Singapore. Those countries just, outfund Australia 100 to 1 with the way they go about doing that. So that's the first thing. Every state has its own, for innovation, and some of them have more dedicated sort of ag tech programs now, which is great. Most of it is very difficult to access. Almost entirely you need matched funding. So you need, 100K in cash to start off with, which for a startup with no money is, a huge hurdle to get over. Most of them have criteria that you have to work with a university or someone else that just complicates the whole thing in a way that makes it almost impossible to get any funding. And a lot of it is lip service and window dressing around ecosystem funding and everything else, which, not to be sniffed at, is still good, but it's not serious funding like Israel or Belgium put down, for example. So the universities and CSIRO, they do a lot of great research, which is great. And, having CSIRO as a partner for us, we licensed the tech from them, was a fantastic shot up the arm in terms of validation. Governments took us seriously because of that. Overseas government, it's a well-respected organisation. And Australian, ag universities and that are very well respected globally, as is the whole country. So that's great. The federal government has the CRC model, which is great as well for doing research. And there's some serious buckets of funding there if you can manage to wangle that and so on. All of these organisations are great at doing R, but very poor at doing D and transferring the technology. Things are getting better, like each of the universities setting up their own startup hub and programs, accelerator programs and so on. And that's great. And that's, they're all moving in that a much better direction and they're getting better at it. But I think ultimately it's, $20,000 to kick off a startup that is developing a piece of hardware is like, minuscule. It's chicken feed. It's nice, but it's not enough. So if you get to the VC landscape, one of the most exciting things that's happened is, of course, the development of Tenacious Ventures.
I was wondering when you're going to land on that.
Which is fantastic. I thought Matt and Sarah launching that was a great step forward, because most of the VCs that I encountered in Australia would not look at us because they didn't understand ag tech. They didn't understand, hardware development and timescales and all that work, how all that works and so on. And it was just, really difficult for any ag tech, unless they were doing some app, that they could turn around and demonstrate in a short time. There was no opportunity. The thing I'd like to point out to people, though, is every venture fund, in order to raise money and set it all up, they've got to have a strategy and a criteria and a profile and, a ticket size. And as far as VC goes, Tenacious Ventures is quite small, and it's the first in Australia doing that. And in order to do that, they've got to have a profile and the sort of startup that they can help and invest in. But that only covers a niche, and they've targeted a great niche at the early stage, which is wonderful. But there's a lot of more opportunity there in Australia for other startups in different stages doing different stuff that Tenacious Ventures can't, invest in. So there's plenty of opportunity if you want to start a new agtech venture fund that's going to look at other people and other startups. That's an opportunity. It's great to have one player, but there's room for a lot more, I think, and that would be, a great thing to do.
I guess sort of in your time from when you first started Adjacents to now, there's been a lot of evolution in the ecosystem itself with pop-up of accelerators, and now ourselves as a sector-specific fund. There's a few initiatives specifically out there, and even LaunchVic, who's doing some things in the ag tech space, and there's certainly some momentum gathering in this space. And I would say it's an exciting time to be considering some of these propositions. So maybe you can give us a little bit of what you think might be the future of this industry of livestock farming, and the kind of skills that you think are necessary for somebody to play in this space, whether that be engaging with a startup or otherwise.
Yeah. So in terms of the startup landscape, who are we talking about first?
What do you think the future of livestock farming, ag tech? How do you think that's going, and the kind of skills that we might need to get there?
Yeah, I think around this, this is the $1 million question of what's going to happen to livestock farming. And there's people out there saying, with Impossible Foods making factory meat, we won't need to have any livestock farming anymore. But, if I look forward another 20 to 30 years, I would say there's a couple of things to be understood around that. One is that as an example, there is a very significant environmental issue in Europe and the UK and across North America, because if you take the Highlands of Scotland, for example, the natural part of the environment is to have cattle grazing on their highlands. And they've been doing that for 10,000 years. And now, because it's unprofitable and they can't get people to actually do the work, because no one wants to go and climb up a fell in the middle of the snow to herd cattle around in the heather and the snow and goodness knows what else. So cattle are coming off those environments, and they've got a huge environmental issue that they are spending billions of euros to try and address. And our product actually helps them do that, because they can then manage those cattle without employing people to do it. But keeping cattle on there is really important in terms of managing the environment. We have the same issues in Australia. Although cattle are part of the natural environment, they are part of the management landscape. And so there is a growing opportunity and need to use agricultural land to manage our environmental sustainability. So not as a barrier to environmental sustainability, but as the primary tool to manage it. And those needs are increasing all the time. As an example is just carbon farming and the development of, we have a huge landmass here that is actually a carbon sink. Why don't we put carbon in it? And if we do that, we actually improve the soil and make it more productive, and you can produce more stuff. So livestock are an important part of that sort of landscape. So I think that is one compelling direction that people will go in. So we'll still have steak and beef and dairy and all the rest of it. The other thing that there is going to be, because of the labour problem, there is increasing drive to automate. And I think automation will take over things like picking fruit, doing all of those labour-intensive, sometimes complicated labour-intensive, which can be solved by AI. There will be an increasing drive to do that because it will be more effective, more economical, and will have less social problems. And the other one is, I think that there is a increasing drive for better quality, better reliability, more resilience. And so you're going to find that what's happening in livestock are people are going from managing a farm to managing herds to now managing individual animals. So our tool enables farmers to manage and watch an animal 24/7, every second of the day, 365 days of the year, and know exactly what is important about that animal rather than a herd of animals. And I think you're going to see that trend increasing. And in other horticulture, you're going to see much more focus on this tree and that tree and this patch of ground with, its particular chemistry and that patch of ground rather than a whole paddock. And you can see that in terms of the, variable rate fertilizer production and application, all those other technologies that are coming through. So I think that's an important direction. And skills that require farmers to be able to move in that direction will be very important. To me, it was a bit a dumbest comment that people made, but they made it repeatedly when I launched AgSense was, oh, farmers have got to use a computer and a new tool, and it's got GPS, got all these technologies, but farmers are fairly simple sort of people. And, that flies completely in the face of all my experience with farmers and historically. So farmers have always been at the forefront of what they can do with their farm and very keen adopters of technologies that actually work and actually deliver outcomes. And if you look back historically, whenever a technology came that was really valuable, farmers might have had a very simple education, but they picked it up, they did what they had to do to learn how to use it. So this idea that farmers lags in innovation is completely wrong. And that's very much an approach of people who haven't had that experience of, being on a farm and actually doing it in practice, I think. So I think you're going to see a big drive towards that, an upskilling of farmers, and because all of these technologies require greater complexity, they're going to have to learn more disciplines and more skills and more knowledge across that area. But I think they'll do that without problem.
Right. And then in terms of, I guess, the skills and the workforce and the people who might be looking to help deliver some of those solutions to help our farmers, what sort of skills do you think they might need in terms of being able to develop this type of precision agriculture that you've been speaking on, that will be able to deliver sort of that on, single animal resolution, as it were?
Yeah. So this comes back to, the sort of skills that you need in the startup, but also in a corporate. And there's a mix of skills there, I think. So you need people who have a vision and are passionate and who can champion that. Every startup needs a champion, otherwise it never happens. And every technology needs a champion. It just needs someone with a vision and a passion to make that work. To actually, get something working, though, you need people with experience and real skill in that area. A good example would be people like our friend Katie Cooper, who eventually we needed our aerial redesign because it just didn't work. We'd had 3 different experts work on it. You just need people like her who can who know how to do these things. And so you need that professional expertise in a particular area that you just can't do without. Our animal training person, Sally, was just completely invaluable. We would not have made it without her. Impossible. So you need that. In terms of the softer skills, though, there's a whole lot of other things that you need. So one is, particularly in a startup, and someone who's an innovator, you need people who are happy and excited to work in an environment where there are no rules and everything's uncertain. I employed people when I only had 2 months of funding left. And my only backstop was to fund them by withdrawing down on my mortgage. And they knew them. So you need people who are okay with that environment. Even better, you need people who thrive in that environment, who love the uncertainty and the opportunity and all the rest of it that goes, with that, who you can give a vague direction to and they can just take it and run with it without, close supervision and all of those sort of things. So you need people with that attitude and skill set and opportunity. And you need people who have good transferable skills, that are multi-talented, that can do this and do that, and are happy to do that, But then as you get out of that, you need people who have just a depth of experience and what I would call people who are scarred but not damaged. So I had a lot of scars by the time I launched AgSense, which was I'd made a lot of mistakes, But, things like getting a CFO, even part-time, who really knows the ins and outs of the tax system and knows how to put a report together for investors, who can stand in front of investors and deliver that and all, that just becomes an essential thing that you need. And if you don't have it, it's a real lack and you're just going to be stumbling around. So you do need real experience. This particularly applies to hardware. You've often seen this yourself where people stumble around, they try and get a CAD thing to do some work, and then they get someone else to do a bit of work and someone else, and they try and do that in a way that they skimp and save, but eventually they just need to get a team of people together who actually know what they're doing.
I think, there's very much the case you touched on with those transferable skills and those types of things. Having myself recently made a pivot from hardware into VC, I think I can attest to some of what you said there about having both the desire to be a generalist as well as a specialist, and sort of applying that to how the business grows and develops over time. I'm looking at some of the audience questions here, and so I might jump into some of those and work through them as well. So one of those was around IoT, and in particular, I guess if you're talking about the Gallagher product, Ian, do you think that IoT is contributing to easier management of regenerative farming practices?
In a word, yes. But I think it's still very early days. There are a lot of things and a lot of opportunity for new practices to be, developed and adopted. I think part of the barrier there is really around understanding and focusing on a market need that you can deliver a solution for. There are a lot of data-based startups in agtech around the world. Some of them are doing the same thing, some are doing different things, but the data world is still, in agriculture, very fragmented, and it's difficult to see how that's all going to pull together in the short term. And part of the reason is that agriculture as an industry is incredibly diverse. If you compare it to medtech, if you go into a hospital in Melbourne, that's pretty similar to a hospital in London, New York, and Beijing. There's not a lot of different stuff they do. But if you go onto a farmer that grows carrots, and then he talk to his next door neighbour who's in dairy, and then talk to his other neighbour who's growing beef, and the next one is growing wheat, they're all very different. They have completely different value chains, completely different supply chains, completely different organisations that look after them, and that they might only be located in the same, 5Ks, but it's hugely diverse. So it will take a long time. The time and the ability, though, is great opportunity for IoT to start delivering some, technologies with the expectation, I think, that those will gradually merge and adapt and come together. And, if you think about the personal computer industry back in 1982, that's where we are today. It's got a long way to go.
Oh, that I think is almost beautifully tying into the next question that we have around a little bit around R&D. And in particular, the question was if you could expand on what you believe is required for the D in R&D, for the development phase. How do we move from sort of that research into actual development and delivery of a product successfully?
Yeah, so you need two things: market need and money. So for the market need, one of the most important things that our universities and CSIRO and so on don't invest in, because it's really hard to do, is they don't invest in understanding where the markets are for their technology. Where is this going to go, and how could it provide a benefit, and which are the big markets that could be focused on? Because if you've got a really big market need and you've got a solution for that need, you will be able to raise money. But if you don't have the need, you'll never raise money, no matter how good your tech is. So I think for that transfer to take place and get it out of some of the R places and into some of the D places, because they need to be different places. You can't do them in the same place. There needs to be, that sort of mechanism. So startups help with that, and doing the startup hubs and that help create that. And so that's a good step forward. But essentially that's the difference. So the D is about D'ing something to meet a market need. The R is about developing technology that might have an application somewhere, that might provide a solution. The reason there need to be different teams is because they require completely different mindsets. So the mindset that you need to do good, thorough research in the university of CSIRO, and the sort of level of creativity and innovation around, that's totally different to the mindset that you need to turn that into a product. And the best way is not to try and contaminate the two, because if you try and make the researchers conform to the D side of the work, you end up with pain and problems for both parties. It won't work. They just have different operating modes. They work for different reasons, different personal drivers. So get it out of the R, get them to help with the D, but get the D people, is a different set of people that are focused and much more driven and make decisions in different ways and work to different timescales and completely different drivers to make them work, and get the R people to help them rather than try and get the R people to do the D. That never really works. So in CSIRO's case, we engaged them and they are still a partner. They've been a wonderful partner for us, but we never put them on the critical path.
So it seems to me there's a case of thinking about the R as that technology and technology risk, and whereas that D part is around the product and taking that technology and converting it into the product and finding the market for it and those types of things, which you did with Gallagher. And
one of the alarm bells I hear is startup says, we have CSIRO as our R&D team. To me, that's uh-oh. That's not going to work.
I guess sort of one of the other questions that we have is maybe a sort of opposing sort of thing is so in this particular case, the person's saying if they have a client with specifications and a market need, I guess to some extent validated, does that change the financing strategy at all?
So if you have a market need and you have a product solution, and a technology in that product that is going to meet the need, then yes, theoretically you have an investable proposition. The next question is, money is the capital markets it's a marketplace, which means it's competitive. So is your offering, investment offering, better than the next guy? And so if you have a very big market and your technology and product has a very low risk, then you're going to be more competitive than the next guy. But if your market opportunity is smaller and you've got more risk, you're not going to be as competitive. And, if you think about startups like Uber back in 2013, when they had revenue, proven market, a model that can scale and all the rest of it, people threw money at them. When I started Adjacense, I had a technology, a whole lot of problems to solve, a very big market, but a difficult journey to get there. And, there were factors that made that hard then. As we got more money involved and we got Gallagher and other people, the risk level came down and the market opportunity went up. It became easier to fund it.
So maybe in our last couple of minutes, you can tell us a little bit about, I guess, sort of ultimately a successful product, great market fit, acquired by Gallagher. How did it feel to have a successful startup and go through an acquisition? And I guess if you think back to, if not now, then when? If not me, then who? That catalyst moment about taking on and starting a startup. How does it feel to have come full cycle in that journey?
Yeah, I guess the first thing is immense sort of satisfaction, because at the end of the day, the proof that you did something worthwhile is the fact that people are prepared to pay very substantial amounts of money to buy it. Having something that people wanted to fight over was an indication that, I created something people wanted. And in a way, that's the dream of every startup, is to be able to So yeah, I did that. The other sort of satisfaction was that, okay, you know, maybe not every shareholder had their dream and everything else, but by hook or by crook, we ended up doing what we said we were going to do. We got it there. So that was really great. There's a little bit of, you know, it would be nice to keep going on that journey and be part of that. But at the same time, doing whatever, it takes a lot out of you. And, you know, as a result of that, I did suffer some health issues, which I'm still grappling with. And all I'd say is, you know, overseas travel and getting colds and staying in hotel rooms in the winter in Europe, it's not a good idea. You know, okay, I know it'd be nice to continue on, but I'm happy to stop now. And the other side of it is, you know, I'm very happy to help other people on that journey. And, you know, I'm continuing to provide consulting services to people who want around, you know, helping them provide advice and guidance and things that they need to help get them started and get going. And I really enjoy doing it. And so it's an opportunity for me to say, okay, I learned a lot. I can pass that on to some other people. And hopefully that way I can see other startups launch and get going rather than continuing the journey on my own. And 7 years is a long time. You know, that's a fair part of your career. So enough is enough. You know, I have a very good relationship with the Gallagher guys. I really like them. They were fairly tough, but they were pretty fair. And they personally stood by me. Like, you know, they'd negotiate over funding and all sorts of things, and they were tough negotiators. But there was always this personal connection where they had my back personally out of all of that, which, you know, was really important to have, and was great to know, you know. So yeah, I was very happy to hand it over to them in the sense that they were a good company. Like they were people that were going to do something with it. I don't know what they're going to do with it ultimately, and they probably don't know either. But I know they're going to, you know, they didn't buy it because just to waste their time on it. They're going to make it part of their company.
And do you think it made it just that little bit sweeter, them being the, you know, one of the first people that invested and backed you in sort of the early days with Adjacents?
Yeah, to a certain extent, you know, if someone was going to deserve it, they made a big difference. Their initial investment, though, was very small, was like the trigger that said, okay, other investors are now willing to put money in. That was an important stepping stone, you know, in terms of value inflection, having a corporate, international, recognised agtech innovator, you know, that was well known to farmers around the world. So that was a stamp of approval, which was really great and critically important.
Brilliant. I think we are wrapping up, and there's Abigail just now.
Thank you so much, Ian, for taking us through the journey from Woe to Go. It has been a fascinating conversation. And Vella, thank you so much for your interesting, you know, probing questions. I think we've covered an enormous amount in this short period of time. So I don't know what everyone else is, but there's so many different ideas. And thank you to those who engaged through the chat. That's always really wonderful. So enjoy, be safe. Obviously, we've been dealing with earthquakes, etc. today. So be safe. Thanks again, Ian and Vella. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next Pivot event. Take care. See you.
Thanks. Bye, guys.